Hello, thank you for listening. My name is Arthur Sterling, and I want to tell you a story from a time when I was just 36 years old. Before the war, my world was built from words. It smelled of newsprint, cheap coffee, and the metallic tang of typewriter ink on my fingers. I was a journalist in Chicago, you see. I believed, with the earnest conviction of a man who makes his living from it, in the power of narrative. Every event, no matter how chaotic, could be wrestled into a structure. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had protagonists and antagonists. My job was to find that shape, to carve a clean, understandable story out of the messy block of reality. I thought truth was a matter of proper arrangement. The war taught me that the truest things have no shape at all. They're just a raw, screaming mess. People back home, they read my dispatches under the glow of a living room lamp. They wanted to know about heroism, about strategy, about the inexorable march to Berlin. They wanted a story that made sense, and for a long time, I tried to give them one. But how do you write a beginning for something that feels like it has always been? And how do you write an end for a memory that never, ever leaves? It all came to a head for me in a place the Germans called Der Kessel, the cauldron. We called it the Falaise Pocket. For me, it was the place where all my stories came apart. The air in August of '44 was thick enough to chew. It was a greasy cocktail of diesel fumes, cordite, and something else, something sweet and cloying that turned your stomach. The smell of death, old and new, baked by the summer sun. We were advancing with the Big Red One, pushing to close the jaws of the trap on the German 7th Army. From a distance, on a map in some general's tent, it probably looked clean. A neat pincer movement, a decisive victory. Up close, it was the devil's butcher shop. The roads were clogged with the burnt-out skeletons of tanks and transport trucks, German Panzers and American Shermans tangled together like fossilized beasts. The fields were littered with the detritus of a routed army, helmets, gas mask canisters, discarded rifles, and personal letters that fluttered in the hot wind like pale, dying butterflies. And bodies. Everywhere the bodies. Men and horses bloated and awful in the Normandy heat. My job was to observe, to be the unflappable eye, the conduit of information. I carried a notepad and a Leica camera, not a rifle. My armor was my press pass and a carefully constructed professional detachment. I was Art Sterling, war correspondent. I was there to get the story, not to be in it. It was a flimsy shield, and it was about to be shattered. The world dissolved into a scream of incoming artillery. It's a sound you feel in your teeth before you hear it with your ears, a tearing, ripping noise, like God dragging a jagged piece of metal across the sky. I dove, hitting the dirt with a grunt, my face pressed into the soil of a French farm. The ground bucked and heaved. Dirt rained down on my helmet. I could taste the grit. When the immediate shelling stopped, the air was filled with a new sound, the frantic, high-pitched crackle of machine gun fire. A German MG-42, the Hitler's buzzsaw. The sound was unmistakable, a frantic, desperate hammering that seemed to chew up the very air. We were caught, pinned down in the open. A young sergeant from Ohio, face caked in mud, screamed, "Farmhouse." On me, go, 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 I ran. I'd never known I could move that fast. It wasn't a choice, it was pure animal instinct. My legs pumped, my lungs burned, my notepad forgotten somewhere in the mud. The farmhouse was a stone skeleton, its roof blasted away, one wall buckled inward. But it was cover. We piled in through a splintered doorway, a half-dozen of us, panting and terrified, smelling of sweat and fear. The squad was a typical mix. The sergeant, a kid named Miller who couldn't have been more than 20. A heavyset bar gunner from Brooklyn who kept whispering prayers in Italian. A medic, Wade, with eyes that looked 1,000 years old. They collapsed against the walls, checking ammo, gulping from their canteens. I fumbled for my notepad, my hands shaking. The journalist's instinct was kicking in. Get the details, names, hometowns, the story, and then we heard it. A soft sound from the corner of the room, behind a pile of rubble and splintered furniture. A moan, a wet, agonizing sound. Sergeant Miller had his M1 up in a flash. "Who's there? Sound off," he hissed, his voice cracking. The only answer was another gasp, followed by a torrent of German. It was a boy's voice. High and thin with pain. Miller gestured, and two of his men moved forward, rifles leveled. They pulled away a broken table, and there he was. He couldn't have been more than 17. He was wearing the field gray uniform of the Wehrmacht, but it was soaked through with a dark, glistening red from a wound high in his chest. His face was pale, almost translucent, covered in a fine sheen of sweat. His eyes were wide with terror, blue as a summer sky, and they darted between us like a cornered animal. One of his hands was clutching a small, worn photograph. He was a child, a dying child, dressed in the enemy's uniform. My mind, the writer's mind, started churning. Here was the story, the enemy face to face, the grim reality of war. I should have been taking notes, composing the laid sentence for my dispatch. In a shell-torn farmhouse on the road to Falaise, American GIs cornered a wounded Nazi, but the words felt hollow. They felt like a lie. "Jesus Christ," the kid from Brooklyn whispered. The German boy started coughing, a horrible rattling sound. Blood flecked his lips. He was drowning from the inside. The air in the room grew thick. The world outside, with its machine guns and mortars, seemed to fade away. Our universe was now just these four crumbling stone walls, the stench of blood and dust, and the sound of this boy's labored breathing. He wasn't the enemy. He wasn't a Nazi or a Kraut. He was a set of blue eyes, a rasping lung, and a hand clutching a picture of what looked like his mother. Wade, the medic, moved. He shuffled forward on his knees, his hands held out and open to show he was no threat. "Easy now, son," Wade said, his voice soft, almost a lullaby. The German soldier flinched, his eyes wild with fear. Wade didn't stop. He set his medical kit down and opened it. "Just want to take a look." "Just want to help." Sergeant Miller looked conflicted. Every instinct, every bit of training told him this was the enemy, a threat, but he looked at the boy, then at Wade, and just gave a short, sharp nod. Time seemed to warp in that room. Outside, the battle for the Falaise Pocket raged on, a symphony of industrial slaughter. Inside, an American medic was gently cutting away the uniform of a German soldier. I watched, mesmerized. My pen felt impossibly heavy in my hand. What was the story here? Where was the narrative? Was this an act of American compassion? A moment of weakness? It wasn't clean, it didn't fit. The boy muttered something. Wasser, a universal word, water. Someone passed Wade a canteen. He gently lifted the boy's head and let a few drops trickle onto his pale lips. The boy's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, a fleeting second of relief in a sea of agony. Then they opened again and locked with mine. For a moment he wasn't a German, I wasn't an American. We were just two men in a stone room, surrounded by death, both utterly, completely terrified. I saw it then, the truth. The war wasn't about the maps or the generals or the flags. It was about this suffocating, intimate, and terrible moment of shared humanity in a place designed to extinguish it. The real story wasn't the grand, sweeping epic of armies colliding. It was the small, heartbreaking tragedy of a boy from Hamburg dying on a stone floor in France, while a boy from Virginia tried to comfort him. He died a few minutes later. It wasn't dramatic. There was no final speech. His breathing just stopped. A soft sigh and he was gone. The photo fell from his slack fingers. Wade gently closed the boy's eyes, his face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. The kid from Brooklyn crossed himself. Silence. The guns outside had fallen quiet for a moment. In that silence, the weight of what had happened settled on us. We had just shared the last moments of an enemy's life. We had offered him comfort, and now he was just another body in a field of bodies. I finally started writing. My hands were steady now. I wasn't writing for the newspapers back home. I wasn't thinking about headlines or censors. I was writing for that boy. I described the color of his eyes, the sound of his breathing, the worn crease in the photograph he held. I wrote about the medic's gentle hands. I didn't write about heroes or villains. I wrote about 5 terrified Americans and 1 dying German, all trapped together in the same small, crumbling room, all victims of the same colossal madness. When we finally left that farmhouse hours later, stepping back into the blasted landscape, I knew I had my story. It wasn't the one my editors wanted, but it was the only one I could possibly tell. I spent the rest of my life telling stories, but I never again believed they could be neat and tidy. That farmhouse broke my old faith. The world, I learned, isn't a narrative you can shape. It's a document you bear witness to. My dispatch about that boy, about that room, was almost buried. The censors called it detrimental to morale. They said it humanized the enemy. It took a fight, a big one, to get even a watered-down version of it printed. They wanted a story about closing a pocket. I gave them a story about opening a heart, just for a moment, in the middle of hell. That was the scar it left on me. I came to understand that my job wasn't to create order from chaos, but to honestly report the chaos itself, to show the human cost that gets lost between the bold-faced headlines and the casualty reports. Some things, some truths, they don't have a beginning or an end. They just are, and they leave a mark on you that never fades. The hardest lesson is this. In war, the lines you think are so clear, friend and foe, good and evil, they blur and dissolve in the mud and the blood. The real truth isn't found in the grand declarations of politicians or the strategic maps of generals. It's found in the quiet moments of shared terror, in a medic's touch, in the eyes of a dying boy who is 1,000 miles from his home, just like you are. This memory is a piece of shrapnel I carry. It's heavy. Help me carry it. Subscribe and ensure these stories are never left to rust in silence.